Queen Camilla has broken a centuries-old royal precedent by declaring that she firmly refuses to attend the future coronation of the Prince of Wales. Camilla's face twisted into pure, venomous rage as William elevated Diana to a permanent matriarchal status, rendering Camilla a mere historical footnote. In a towering fury, she slammed her hands down, threw her diamond brooch at his feet, and stormed out, vowing never to return. Inside the fortified walls of Kensington Palace, a single drop of crimson wax has sealed the geopolitical destiny of the British monarchy, triggering the most explosive constitutional crisis since the 1936 abdication. It is now officially confirmed. Prince William, Prince of Wales, has struck a lethal, definitive blow to the institutional standing of his stepmother. He has issued a document so legally absolute, so culturally seismic, and so clinically executed that it effectively rewires the future of the House of Windsor. This is no longer a matter of backroom gossip, leaked familial grievances, or a temporary emotional fallout. This is an institutional execution. The document in question, a royal decree drafted in total secrecy by William's closest constitutional advisors and personal legal counsel, bears the heavy, unmistakable signature of the heir to the throne. Delivered via secure courier directly to the Privy Council and the Lord Chamberlain's office, the decree has already been formally integrated into the state's contingency frameworks for the next reign. This is not a proposal. This is not a point of discussion or a leverage tool designed to force better behavior behind palace doors. It is a supreme procedural directive, possessing absolute legal weight. Within the constitutional mechanisms of the United Kingdom, the heir to the throne maintains definitive authority over the planning, financing, and structuring of their own coronation. By codifying this directive now, William has removed the issue from the realm of family politics and locked it into the unyielding machinery of state law. There are no clauses for negotiation, no mechanisms for appeal, and no provisions for delay. The decree states, with terrifying clarity, the permanent and total revocation of Camilla's right to attend, witness, or participate in any ceremony, liturgy, or public gathering under his sovereign jurisdiction. The granular details of the decree reveal a strategy of absolute erasure. William has not merely demoted Camilla, he has legally vanished her from the future tapestry of the state. According to highly classified operational briefs leaked from the heart of the Lord Chamberlain's office, the restriction framework operates on 5 unalterable pillars of exclusion. The invitation ban. No formal invitation shall be generated, printed, or dispatched to Camilla, Queen Consort, or any legal entity representing her estate. Her name is permanently expunged from the sovereign guest registry. The security blockade. Her identity has been permanently omitted from the state security clearance database for Westminster Abbey. In the eyes of Metropolitan Police counter-terrorism commands and royal protection officers, she will possess no valid credentials, making her physical entry into the security perimeter a literal impossibility. The liturgical void. There will be no seat allocated for her within the nave, choir, or transepts of Westminster Abbey. Her name has been deleted from the liturgical program, and no prayers, mentions, or formal recognition of her status will be uttered by the Archbishop of Canterbury. The balcony exclusion. Under no circumstances will she be permitted access to the staterooms of Buckingham Palace leading to the historic balcony. She is entirely barred from appearing alongside the sovereign during the public flypast. The processional veto. She is prohibited from entering any royal carriage, state car, or ceremonial procession. Her presence is banned from the entire route, from the monarch's presentation to the final state banquet. The phrasing used in the document does not treat her as a disgraced royal or a demoted family member, an anonymous senior constitutional archivist revealed. It treats her as a non-entity. The legal language bypasses her title completely, referencing her solely as a person whose presence would actively invalidate the constitutional purity of the oath. It is the coldest document to emerge from Kensington Palace in a century. To grasp the immense scale of this shockwave, the institutional shockwave rippling through Whitehall and the Commonwealth, one must contrast William's decree with the centuries of unbreakable royal precedent. By historical tradition, the role of a queen consort or a dowager queen during a transition of power is sacred. She represents the living bridge of continuity, the embodiment of institutional memory, and the solemn dignity of the previous reign. Traditionally, she occupies the most prominent, elevated seat in Westminster Abbey, positioned directly adjacent to the new monarch, symbolizing that the crown's majesty transcends individual mortality. She is meant to stand as a pillar of strength, an unassailable figure of matriarchal respectability, validating the young king's ascension before the eyes of God and the global public. The reality of William's decree shatteringly upends this tradition. By barring Camilla from the abbey, William is performing a public, legal act of supreme veto against her legitimacy. He is declaring to the world that her 20-year project to rehabilitate her image, her elevation to queen consort, and her marriage to King Charles III were nothing more than a temporary aberration in the history of the monarchy, an era he intends to systematically dismantle. It cuts her off from the future of the crown, rendering her influence completely dead the moment Charles's reign concludes. Furthermore, the collateral damage of this decree is devastatingly comprehensive. The document explicitly dictates that this exclusion instantly invalidates the attendance of Camilla's entire maternal family. Her children, Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes, along with her grandchildren, who were shockingly given prominent roles during the 2023 coronation, are completely and utterly banned. They are stripped of any right to invitations, royal transport, or access to Westminster Abbey. William has built an impenetrable wall around his future crown, ensuring that the entire lineage of the woman who disrupted his childhood will never pollute the sacred space of his sovereignty. But the decree does not merely stop at exclusion. It inflicts the ultimate poetic and dynastic justice. In the most breathtakingly audacious move of the entire document, William has declared that the supreme position of honor at his coronation, the very seat of matriarchal majesty, the highest place beside the throne that Camilla spent a lifetime coveting, has been solemnly and permanently reserved to honor his late mother, Diana, Princess of Wales. This action appeals directly to a profound sense of natural justice and cosmic alignment. For the global public and the British electorate, Diana was, is, and will always be the rightful queen who was unjustly denied her crown. She was the first wife, the sacrificial mother of the future king, and the woman who infused the stagnant House of Windsor with genuine, enduring human empathy. She gave her youth, her sanity, and ultimately her life to the preservation of the royal line. To place her memory, her coat of arms, and her symbolic presence at the epicenter of the coronation is an act of absolute moral righteousness. It satisfies a deep, historic hunger for justice that the public has harbored since August 1997. Conversely, Camilla has always been viewed through the lens of history as the interloper, the shadow in the marriage, the architect of domestic ruin, and a figure whose ascent to the title of queen consort was tolerated out of necessity rather than genuine respect. To place Camilla in that sacred seat would be a grotesque distortion of moral order, an insult to the memory of the woman who birthed the heir, and a direct violation of the public's trust. The true catalyst for this rupture did not begin with a debate over seating charts or constitutional law. It unfolded weeks prior during a closed rehearsal inside St. George's Chapel, a space completely stripped of public fanfare, rolling cameras, or cheering crowds. This was meant to be a routine walkthrough to synchronize state procession timings, entrance protocols, and the physical hierarchy of the royal family. In the silent expanse of the historic chapel, every footstep echoed with historical significance, and every minor adjustment to the layout carried an implicit statement about power, survival, and institutional relevance. William expected the day to follow the precise, modern blueprint approved by his private office, positioning Catherine and their children at the absolute forefront of the direct line of succession. George was to stand firmly beside his father, while Charlotte and Louis remained adjacent to their mother, signaling a visual promise of stability to a watching nation. Then, Camilla chose to upend the entire structure. Driven by a deep-seated desire to cement her own family's lasting footprint within the royal machinery, she unilaterally instructed a senior master of ceremonies to alter the physical arrangements. Under the guise of traditional seniority, she demanded that Catherine and Charlotte be displaced from their prominent positions and relocated toward the rear choir stalls, effectively prioritizing her own relatives. William entered the chapel precisely as the physical rearrangement was being executed. He watched in absolute silence as a royal page lifted Charlotte's personalized name card from the front row and carried it toward the back of the chapel. Without uttering a single word or raising his voice, the Prince of Wales crossed the stone floor, deliberately took the card from the assistant's hands, and placed it firmly back in its original position. Camilla approached him near the altar, her posture rigid with an authority she believed she had rightfully earned through decades of public scrutiny and calculated endurance. She told him that as long as his father occupied the throne, the current household maintained absolute control over the ceremonial order of precedence. William turned to face her, his demeanor entirely cold, controlled, and unyielding. He looked directly at her and stated that his wife and daughter would never be pushed into the background to satisfy the personal ambitions or insecurities of anyone else. Nearby, Charlotte stood quietly beside Catherine, acutely aware of the shifting atmosphere, while her mother placed a protective, calming hand on her shoulder. Following the rehearsal, William discovered through internal logs that this was no spontaneous misinterpretation of protocol. Camilla had issued a formalized, written directive to the ceremonial staff hours before the rehearsal even began, proving her actions were part of a deliberate strategy to establish a permanent precedent. For William, the psychological line had been crossed. This was no longer an internal dispute over court etiquette. It was a direct threat to the dignity and future security of his family. He immediately ordered his private office to document every single administrative intervention made by her staff, transforming those records into an unassailable dossier of overreach that would eventually dismantle her position entirely. The inevitable confrontation did not take place in the presence of constitutional lawyers, state officials, or media advisors. There were no private secretaries stationed at the doors to soften the language, and the king was completely absent from the room, leaving the future monarch and his stepmother to face each other without a buffer. The heavy oak doors of the private drawing room at Clarence's house closed, shut behind William, and with him walked decades of suppressed resentment, unspoken grievances, and the painful memories of a fractured childhood. Camilla stood by the window, surrounded by the historical portraits of a dynasty she had spent her entire adult life fighting to belong to, fully prepared to defend her hard-won authority against the man who represented her ultimate displacement. She did not wait for William to speak. Instead, she pushed the formal administrative complaint across the polished table, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and deep indignation. She accused him of transforming a minor disagreement over chapel etiquette into a calculated, aggressive assault on her dignity and the authority of the reigning sovereign. She demanded to know if he truly believed he possessed the right to cross the threshold of her home and question her administrative decisions. William remained standing, refusing to take the seat opposite her. He gripped the back of a nearby chair, his knuckles turning white, though his facial expression remained entirely detached and vacant of warmth. He looked directly at her and asked a single, devastating question. He demanded to know if she had personally authorized the directive to alter the seating arrangement of his daughter, Princess Charlotte. Camilla drew herself up to her full height, her eyes flashing with defiance. She responded that the internal hierarchy of the monarchy required difficult choices, and that Catherine could not expect every major state ceremony to revolve exclusively around the whims of the Wales family. She insisted that her actions were intended to preserve traditional protocol, not to diminish anyone. William's voice dropped to a quiet, lethal register that immediately silenced the room. He told her that this had absolutely nothing to do with protocol or tradition. He stated that it was a clear, malicious abuse of palace machinery designed to marginalize his wife and sideline his children for the sole purpose of asserting her own domestic dominance. His composure remained unshaken until Camilla, attempting to minimize the gravity of the dispute, referred to Charlotte as merely one of many royal grandchildren who must learn their proper place. The word functioned as an immediate catalyst. William pulled the chair back with a sharp, echoing scrape against the floorboards, stepped into her personal space, and pointed a finger directly at her. He warned her never again to speak of his children as if their birthright was a disposable asset or something she had the power to manipulate. The mask of royal decorum completely shattered. Camilla, fueled by decades of feeling hunted by the public and compared unfavorably to Diana, unleashed her own bitter resentment. She shouted that she had endured a lifetime of public hatred, isolation, and media cruelty to support Charles, and she refused to be treated as a temporary tenant or a historical footnote waiting for William to erase her existence. She accused him of viewing every single action through the distorted, vengeful lens of his mother's memory. William paused, the mention of his mother hanging heavily in the suffocating silence of the room. When he spoke again, his voice was terrifyingly calm. He acknowledged that the suffering of his mother would always guide his moral compass, but he insisted that this specific crisis was created entirely by Camilla's current behavior. He systematically listed her recent actions, noting her unauthorized attempts to alter Catherine's state duties, her interference with George's ceremonial education, and her quiet manipulation of internal logistics. Terrified by the absolute finality in his tone, Camilla demanded to know if his father was aware that he was compiling an administrative dossier against his own family. William merely stared at her, stating that the king knew exactly what was necessary to protect the future of the crown. Realizing she could no longer manipulate the situation or appeal to his emotions, Camilla looked at him with pure hatred and demanded to know what his ultimate intention was for his own future coronation. William walked slowly toward the door, paused with his hand on the brass handle, and turned to look at her one final time. He told her that when he took his sacred vows before the nation, she would not be standing beside him, nor would she even be permitted inside the building. He opened the door, leaving her completely alone with the terrifying realization that her greatest ambition had just been permanently dismantled. The strategic isolation of the queen consort within the royal machinery could never be achieved through a simple verbal disagreement or a private emotional outburst. William understood with absolute clarity that a private threat could easily be dismantled by future political pressures, the fragility of family ties, or his father's emotional interventions. To ensure his decision was entirely irreversible, the Prince of Wales quietly began to mobilize the vast, unseen bureaucracy of the monarchy, transforming his personal determination into an immovable administrative reality embedded deep within the state planning framework. He began working through his most trusted constitutional advisors to rewrite the operational directives that govern the highest ceremonies of the realm, constructing a highly disciplined model for the future that naturally excluded Camilla through systemic protocol rather than personal accusation. The psychological toll of this clinical operation began to manifest within the private quarters of Windsor Castle. William requested a formal audience with a veteran constitutional scholar who had spent 40 years advising the sovereign on matters of precedent and state ceremony. The elderly advisor sat beneath the vaulted ceilings of the library, adjusting his spectacles as he read through the strict exclusionary clauses that William had inserted into the preliminary coronation draft. The advisor looked up, his face lined with deep anxiety, and warned the prince that removing the king's wife from the state planning framework would be interpreted by history as a devastating public condemnation of Charles's entire reign. William looked out the window toward the rolling lawns, his face completely rigid, and replied that failing to establish clear boundaries now would compromise the integrity of his own crown before his reign even had an opportunity to begin. When the advisor asked how the king would survive the humiliation of seeing his lifelong companion barred from the most sacred ceremony of his son's life, William's gaze softened for a fraction of a second. He admitted that the only element of this entire strategy that caused him any hesitation was the profound personal pain it would inflict upon his father. Yet, his voice immediately hardened as he issued his final command. He directed that Camilla's household be immediately cut off from all internal communications regarding the future transition of power. He ordered that her staff receive no further security clearances, no logistics briefings, and no access to the centralized transport schedules unless he personally rescinded the order. By denying her office access to security passes, William was not just sending a symbolic message. He was creating a physical barrier that made her presence at any future state ceremony functionally impossible. Security protocols for major royal events are governed by strict parliamentary and police directives, meaning that without the necessary credentials, even a member of the royal family is rendered an outsider. While this administrative trap was being sprung, a senior palace official loyal to Camilla attempted to bypass the restriction by submitting a formal request for her to occupy a prominent historical position in the future ceremony, describing her as the senior matriarch of the royal house. William intercepted the memo, recognized it as a calculated attempt to force her inclusion through the back door, and rejected it without explanation. Throughout this intense bureaucratic warfare, Catherine remained a pillar of quiet strength at Adelaide Cottage. She did not actively demand Camilla's destruction, nor did she seek personal retribution for the insults delivered in the chapel. In a private conversation during the evening hours, she looked at her husband and told him that the decision must rest entirely on his shoulders, as he alone would bear the historical consequences of the fracture. Her remarkable self-control and dignity only served to strengthen William's resolve. He walked to his desk, picked up a historic fountain pen that had once belonged to his father, and signed the finalized operational directive. He stared at his signature for a long moment, capped the pen, and commanded that an official copy be delivered directly to the king's study before the sun went down. As the shadows lengthened across London, the trap was officially sprung, and Camilla's fate was sealed by the very bureaucracy she had spent a lifetime trying to control. When the sun finally set over the London skyline, the sealed document rested heavily upon the mahogany desk of the king. Charles sat alone in his private study, the shadows stretching long across the Persian rugs, surrounded by the overwhelming weight of a reign that had been defined by a constant, agonizing struggle between familial devotion and constitutional duty. He read through the operational directive twice. Every carefully constructed sentence, every bureaucratic restriction, and every unyielding boundary established by his son felt like a physical blow. Camilla had always expected her husband to immediately shred any challenge to her authority, to summon his heir and demand absolute obedience. Instead, the monarch closed the leather dossier, removed his spectacles, and buried his face in his hands. He was a man completely hollowed out by decades of scandal, public relations, battles, and the exhausting effort of forcing the British public to accept the woman he loved. But as he looked at the signature of the Prince of Wales, Charles recognized an undeniable truth. If he chose to force William to reverse this mandate, he would trigger a catastrophic constitutional crisis, permanently alienating the man who held the absolute future of the Windsor dynasty. Choosing silence was an act of profound betrayal to his wife, but fighting his son meant destroying the monarchy itself. The heavy oak doors to the study swung open abruptly. Camilla entered without knocking, her face pale with a mixture of shock and incandescent rage, clutching the notification her own staff had just received. She threw the papers onto the polished surface of his desk and demanded immediate reassurance. She expected the king to rise, to offer comfort, to declare that he would never allow such a monumental humiliation to stand. Charles remained seated. He looked up at her with eyes filled with a devastating, sorrowful exhaustion, and he told her quietly that the Prince of Wales had made his position absolutely clear. The silence that followed was suffocating. Camilla asked, her voice trembling with disbelief, if her husband intended to stand by and watch as she was erased from the historical record of the next generation. When Charles looked away, unable to meet her furious gaze, the silence became a definitive answer. Her anger shattered into a cold, terrifying clarity. She reached to the lapel of her structured dress, unfastened the heavy diamond brooch that Charles had gifted her decades ago, and dropped it onto the documents. She told him that a sovereign who refused to protect his own queen was a man who deserved to stand completely alone. She turned and walked out of the room, her footsteps echoing down the long, empty corridors of a palace that suddenly felt like an isolated fortress. Later that evening, under a cloak of absolute secrecy, the king summoned William to a private drawing room at Windsor Castle. There were no courtiers, no equerries, and no briefing notes. Charles stood by the grand stone fireplace, looking every bit his age, while his son stood tall near the threshold. Charles asked if this brutal severing was truly necessary, or if William was simply punishing the present for the tragedies of the past. William replied, his voice devoid of malice but filled with iron resolve, that the crown could not survive another generation of internal manipulation and blurred boundaries. He explained that if he did not establish absolute discipline now, the monarchy would crumble under the weight of its own domestic dysfunction. Charles listened, his shoulders slumping, and finally admitted the tragic reality of his own reign. He confessed that his lifelong avoidance of conflict had allowed the rot to spread, and he acknowledged that William possessed the necessary ruthlessness that he himself had always lacked. He offered no formal blessing, but his quiet acceptance was the ultimate surrender of power from one generation to the next. By the time morning broke, the impenetrable walls of the palace had failed to contain the secret. The news of the revised royal framework leaked to the national press, sending a massive shockwave across the entire country. The morning broadcasts interrupted their scheduled programming, and special editions of the newspapers were rushed to the printing presses. The public reaction was completely overwhelming. Rather than viewing William as a cruel and vindictive son, the vast majority of the nation rallied behind his decisive leadership. They saw a future king who was finally restoring dignity, order, and unyielding honor to an institution that had been dragged through the tabloid mud for far too long. The media praised his devotion to Catherine and his children, framing his actions as the heroic defense of a pure and modern royal family against the scheming, ambitious remnants of a deeply flawed past. Trapped inside the gilded walls of Clarence House, Camilla watched the television coverage with a burning, uncontrollable fury. She saw the crowds gathering outside Buckingham Palace, holding signs of support for William and Catherine. The narrative she had spent her entire adult life trying to control had completely evaporated before her eyes. She realized that she had been utterly defeated by a man who refused to play her political games. But her pride, immense and unyielding, would not allow her to fade away as a pathetic, rejected outcast. If she was to be removed from the grandest stage in the world, she was determined to make it look like her own deliberate, powerful choice. She ordered her remaining loyal staff to draft a formal, public declaration. She took the pen and aggressively signed a statement announcing that she found the upcoming ceremonial arrangements to be deeply disrespectful to the legacy of the current reign. Therefore, out of her own personal dignity and superiority, she categorically refused to attend the future coronation of the Prince of Wales. She intended the statement to be a devastating insult, a final act of sabotage designed to cast a dark shadow over William's moment of absolute triumph. When the declaration reached Adelaide Cottage, William read it in complete silence. He did not display a single ounce of anger or frustration. Instead, a profound sense of peace washed over him. He handed the heavy parchment to Catherine, who read the bitter, arrogant words of the Queen Consort. Catherine looked at her husband and smiled, a gentle, grounded expression of absolute victory. She told him that Camilla had just given them the greatest gift possible by voluntarily removing herself and severing the final toxic tie to their future. William looked out across the green expanse of the royal estate, feeling the incredible weight of his destiny settling upon his shoulders. The war was officially over. The shadows of manipulation had been entirely banished from their lives. As he stood beside the woman who would one day be crowned rightfully beside him, the future king knew that his reign would begin exactly as he had always intended, completely pure, unbroken, and entirely his own. The public announcement of Camilla's definitive refusal to attend the future coronation marked the absolute conclusion of a decades-long struggle for the soul and direction of the British monarchy. The text of her statement, filled with thinly veiled venom and an arrogant assertion of her own superior dignity, was broadcast across global news networks, yet it failed to deliver the devastating blow she had so carefully intended. Instead of destabilizing the future reign, her public defiance served as her ultimate undoing, cementing her reputation as an embittered and transactional figure who chose personal pride over the stability of the institution she had fought so desperately to inhabit. The public saw right through the carefully crafted facade of her indignation, recognizing that her self-imposed exile was merely a desperate attempt to reframe her total defeat as a grand act of personal sovereignty. In the immediate days following the declaration, the administrative machinery of the palace moved with an unprecedented, clinical efficiency to finalize her total isolation. The office of the Prince of Wales did not issue a counterattack, nor did they engage in a public relations war. Instead, they simply implemented the new operational framework with absolute finality. Camilla's names, titles, and lineage were systematically removed from every single planning document, security protocol, and historical archive relating to the future reign. The state carriages that were once earmarked for her family were reallocated to the direct line of succession, and her remaining staff were quietly reassigned to minor administrative roles outside the center of power. The message from William was entirely unmistakable, delivered not through explosive media leaks, but through the cold, unyielding weight of systemic erasure. Her influence within the royal household had not just been limited, it had been entirely extinguished. Within the private rooms of Clarence House, the reality of her self-inflicted isolation began to settle over Camilla with a suffocating weight. The phones that had once rung constantly with calls from sycophantic courtiers and ambitious politicians fell completely silent. The grand drawing rooms, filled with the historical treasures of past queens, felt increasingly like a gilded mausoleum. She sat alone at her writing desk, staring at the empty space where her diamond brooch had once rested, realizing with a sickening certainty that her final act of defiance had altered nothing. The monarchy was moving forward into a clean, modern era without her, and the history books would record her name not as a triumphant matriarch, but as a temporary and deeply disruptive figure who was ultimately cast out by a superior, unyielding force. At Adelaide Cottage, the atmosphere was defined by a profound sense of lightness and historical vindication. William stood beside Catherine, watching their 3 children play on the manicured lawns of the estate, completely free from the toxic anxieties and hidden manipulations that had plagued his own childhood. The shadow of the past had finally been banished, replaced by a clear, unshakable blueprint for a disciplined and respected reign. William had achieved the ultimate objective of a true leader, protecting his family from immediate threat while simultaneously safeguarding the sacred integrity of the crown. As the sunset cast a golden glow over the ancient stone of Windsor Castle, the Prince of Wales knew that his future reign would begin on his own terms, completely pure, entirely unified, and absolute in its devotion to the people.